Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today I'm going to talk about a major escalation in the fight between Ukraine and Amnesty International. Now, if you've watched many of my other videos, you'll see that my view of Amnesty International is that they're an organization that people usually pay attention to only when they have something to gain from the coverage, which means that Ukraine tends to like Amnesty International when they're criticizing Russia in 400 pages of reports. They don't tend to like the 3 or 4 pages of reports that criticize them. Similarly, Russia will ignore the 300 or 400 pages of criticism directed at them, and they'll propagandize the 3 or 4 pages that are critical of Ukraine, right? And I've talked a little bit about why this is, why the Western-dominated human rights discourse has been very distorted, and why, if you look at the way Amnesty International and other human rights groups are looked at in the rest of the world, they've taken a major hit, primarily because of the fact that human rights have basically become a battleground of hegemony. Now, where I'm going with this is that there is a very real problem in this area, right? On the other hand, Amnesty International is probably one of the only groups that is on the ground looking at international humanitarian law in war-torn areas. And this is kind of a big problem because on one hand you have sort of a global culture war, but on the other hand you have a set of rules which are intended to try to minimize the impacts of actual war between different cultural, basically different cultural parties to those wars. Or different parties from the same culture, it doesn't really matter, but the result is actually kind of interesting because people will usually use one side as a way of ignoring the other side, right? But I do think that Amnesty International has done a really good job in terms of looking at international humanitarian law generally. So at any rate, for those of you who have missed the whole controversy, which is probably none of you, some time ago Amnesty International released a 4-page press release where they said that basically Ukraine wasn't doing enough to try to avoid civilian collateral damage when it comes to places where they put their military or stage attacks from. And basically what Amnesty International's major complaints were staging attacks near hospitals, which would be similar to the accusations that Russia is staging attacks near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, for example. And the second one, accusation basically is not really giving residents right around temporary military bases, which are often set up in schools, because those are often suitable places to do that. Not basically giving neighbors in that area a fair warning and opportunity to maybe move a few hundred meters away. Now, I suspect that all of these are probably accurate. They're not war crimes entirely, but they do undermine some of the rhetoric about other war crimes. For example, if, we all remember when the Mariupol hospital was hit by a bomb of some sort, a munition of some sort. I don't think we have a clear picture on what that was. The accusation was that Russia deliberately targeted the hospital, but if there were, for example, Ukrainian armed forces right next to the hospital staging an attack somewhere, then it could just simply be they were firing at the troops and missed, right? And this is why it's not a good idea to have troops right next to hospitals engaging in hostile actions, right? Same thing with nuclear power plants, right? The accusation of Russia staging attacks from near nuclear power plants is very troubling for very much the same reason. So then this basically went into the news cycle for a couple of weeks. The head of basically the entire Ukrainian Amnesty International branch ended up resigning and quitting the organization. I'm going to get into why in a moment, because I don't think we've been told the whole story on that. This has basically succeeded in keeping this in the news cycle for a long time. Finally, Amnesty International announced that they'll review it. But in the meantime, they also offered a sorry, not sorry. We're sorry we hurt your feelings, but we stand by our conclusions sort of apology. So that's basically the history. Now, I was taking a look at some things, and basically I was able to determine that the Ukrainian government and possibly other private parties attached to them have taken this to another level. And this also explains why the Ukrainians in the Ukrainian chapter of Amnesty International all felt like they had to leave. And this is that there's a website called Mirotvorets, I think, which means peacekeepers, but basically it's a list of so-called enemies of Ukraine. Now, some people call this a hit list, some other people say it's not a hit list, but there are certain things which are undeniable. Number one is that when somebody is killed on that list, they seem to approve of that. And the second thing is that it does have ties to the Ukrainian government. May also have ties to other governments, I don't know. They also will list personal information, home addresses, things like that. So far, as far as I can tell, all the people killed on that list have either been in Ukraine or Russia. And almost all of them have been in Ukraine. Now, the reason for that's actually fairly simple. If Ukrainian, whether it's special forces or radical individuals or whatever, start killing people in Western countries, that's probably going to destroy any support that the West has for Ukrainian resistance, right? So I don't think that people who are in the West, whether they're Pink Floyd's drummer or whether they're the head of Amnesty International or Scott Ritter or anybody else, really has to fear being on this list. Because the consequences of a murder that would be tied back to that list and tied back to Ukrainian resistance in the West would be fatal for the Ukrainian government at present, right? So that's that. But I did check, and the head of Amnesty International has been placed on that list. In other words, there is something of an encouragement to target Amnesty International as an organization within Ukraine. If you were to go to Ukraine as a member of Amnesty International, you would probably need to fear for your life. That's the way that is. That's a stupid move, okay? Now, I'm not, as we've already covered, I'm not the greatest fan of Amnesty International. I think that they are a proponent of global liberalism in a way that I do not support. But basically, sort of, the idea that people need to be physically intimidated or, if necessary, killed in order to be pushed out of the country is picking a fight that I don't think is winnable. Okay. The first thing is so a couple of reasons why I say that. Number one, Ukraine has managed to handle the Amnesty International fight in terms of PR as a masterclass of doing everything wrong. The actual accusations weren't that bad. Basically, they turned it into this massive, oh my gosh, they're supporting the Russian terrorists narrative, which isn't going to go very far, right? And what this basically means is nobody thinking about the question of international humanitarian law and how prisoners of war are going to be treated and how civilians are going to be protected is really going to trust Ukraine if they are picking fights with all the watchdogs, right? A correct response would have been, we're still investigating, we haven't had time to complete our investigation. Obviously we care about civilians and we will adjust how we operate if that's necessary. But the story would have gone away. But instead, they've done everything they can to keep it in the news cycle, and now basically they've basically said we would be quite happy if the head of Amnesty International weren't alive anymore. And that's a problem, right? It's a very big problem. So this is the sort of thing which is going to continue to undermine support for the country at home and abroad, right? We're now at a point where the IAEA observers are at this Operation Nuclear Power Plant. I don't think they're going away at this point. I think they basically said we will report on what's going on here, and that way you don't have to listen to the Ukrainian or the Russian government. You can listen to us, which for whoever is actually shelling the plant is probably pretty terrifying. And that's probably not Russia, given the power realities in southern Ukraine at the moment. But Russia might be launching attacks from near the nuclear power plant, and if they're doing that, I'm fairly sure that they'll stop. I don't think they want the IAEA calling them out on that. So hopefully that means the risk of nuclear catastrophe is going down, but that may also put the IAEA at some point on a collision with Ukraine if the shelling hasn't stopped, right? So the thing about this is, what I'm trying to get at in this is, one of the getting back to Amnesty International, as I say, the fundamental problem with Amnesty International is that because you have this mixture of laws of war and also effectively global culture war in how they operate, they are going to be doing some... Basically, the thing is that it's very easy to ignore them when you want to, and it's very hard to avoid... There's basically nothing that they could possibly say or do which wouldn't be propaganda material, right? For those who want to create propaganda out of it. And so my view is that we really need a dedicated, probably UN-based organization which goes in and does nothing but law of war, okay? Law of war assessments. Should not be tied to the International Criminal Court. It should be They just go in, they observe, they report to the public. Because that's the best work Amnesty does, right? The rest of it, not so great. But that work they do well. And somebody needs to do it. And governments need to be held accountable when they don't live up, whether it's Israel or Ukraine or Russia or the Palestinian Authority or, whoever, right? The United States. There needs to be that level of accountability, and it needs to be public and it needs to be transparent. And no, they shouldn't wait to absolutely have to get feedback on every report before they can publish. But because of this mix of missions, I don't believe that Amnesty can do it. On the other hand, I think that the idea of treating the organization as an enemy of the country is a strategic blunder of the highest proportions. I don't think people will forget it soon. At any rate, that's what I have today. Come back later. I'll publish more at another time.